Welcome to Technosocial. My name is Daniel Fraga.
And I'm Owen Cox. Here we're talking about all things shamanic, symbolic, occult, and technology.
Consider becoming our patron, donating, and helping us continue to pump more of this weird and wacky content from the other side of reality all the way to the comfort of your own screen. We hope you enjoy.
To do what I sort of playfully refer to as escaping the state of nature. So, the state of nature is dangerous. All living things have been born into this world where, there's some cooperation, but there's definitely competition, and, we're going to perish and all of that. And escaping that feels like just sort of a warm environment of whatever it is that you like. So we call that kind of lotus eating. So that this is old kind of, Homer type reference to the lotus eaters on I forget the name of the island that the lotus eaters were on, but these are folks who are sort of pursuing pleasure. While world eaters are not necessarily Machiavellian per se, I don't want to paint them in any kind of moral light, but these are folks who would prefer to who essentially believe, let's put it this way, who essentially believe that you have to be strong to be safe. So these are people who enter the digital world in order to compete more effectively in the state of nature rather than escape from it. And in my personal opinion, I'm not advocating for people being more ambitious or controlling, but I do think that there is no escape for the state of nature. So that there will be another category of folks who leverage these technologies to really better wield their own ability to manage people, not necessarily manipulate, do anything, manage people, manage processes, pursue their objectives, potentially garner, control and influence in things like politics, things like business, things like the future of technology, who want to sort of really have a more firm stake in the digital and even the physical world by going into these digital systems. So this is a smaller group of people who are more ambitious and who don't feel comfortable escaping the state of nature. They feel as though they won't be safe unless they continue to compete in it. And I think there's actually a lot of truth to that latter position. But we can go in whatever direction we want.
Okay, so do you think that in order to achieve dominance in the digital sphere, what are the big differences between how to achieve dominance in the digital sphere versus how to achieve dominance in the real world as has been done hitherto? In other words, what are the most salient differences?
Yeah. Well, I like your Shakespearean English. So I like thine Shakespearean English. I would say that the way that I frame it, so I have another essay called The Substrate Monopoly, which is pretty Googleable, just those two terms, substrate monopoly. Basically, I think thus far, so for a very, very long time, dominance was, size of your army and their relative allegiance, you know what I mean? And your ability to wield them. Which I presume, had to do with, can you feed them well? Do you have a society that's wealthy enough to give them the right kind of, bronze or the right kind of steel or the right kind of what have you? That then kind of expanded into kind of winning the economic and the technological progress game, in addition to having the most force. And force, obviously, now is much more technology than it is muscle compared to, 2,000 years ago. Moving forward, my supposition is that what winning looks like, for the epitomally ambitious, for the Napoleons of whoever's alive now, the highest win is essentially owning the digital substrate where the majority of human experience is housed and where the most powerful AI live. Let me just give you an example. That's very abstract. So let's just say, and I'm not calling Zuckerberg bad or good. I'm going to do very little demonizing and deifying on this chat. I just happen to believe that I have a really hard time putting horns and halos on people. I just have a very hard time. So pure neutral. Let's just talk about Zuckerberg. Let's say that the investment in Oculus was a very smart one. Let's say that by whatever fluke, he's able to have a huge amount of work. We're all in this pandemic, so we're doing more things digitally. VR has not necessarily skyrocketed during this period, but over the course of the next decade and a half, I suspect it will at some point. If we start to live, if we have, visors on our eyes, right now I have all these monitors. If eventually we can have experience on our eyes where we can do really effective work, we can have all the screens open, doing whatever we need to do on all of our different screens. We can have notifications kick in, have, background environments that are soothing or exciting relative to what we need to be maximally productive. We can exist in those environments for work. We're gonna work there because it'll be more enjoyable and productive. Similarly with relating to people, you and I write very few handwritten letters. We do a lot of these Skype type calls. Eventually there will be something more immersive, more interesting than that for connecting with people. Eventually, the technology already, you have people that are, dating who've never met. I think that will become, all the more prevalent as technologies become more super immersive. So what I'm getting at is, as more and more of the developed world live the bulk of their waking hours inside of a virtual system, not at screens, but actually like all their senses pumped into a virtual system, whoever owns that virtual system basically owns what is functionally reality. Functionally, reality is perceived. So they'll functionally own reality. If you functionally own reality, if most of what's going on with human beings happens in your substrate, in your compute, across your system, that data can be trained on. That data can develop machines that are great at conversation, that are great at sales, that are great at you name it, whatever it is that humans are doing, writing code, creating art, whatever the case may be. So where the bulk of human sentience lives in virtual substrate, I suspect the most powerful AI will also live. And if you can own that, and I don't know if any human or any one party will, but if you can own the substrate where the majority of human experience and the strongest AI exist, that would be winning in the future. Very different than bronze, very different than growing corn. That would be winning in the technological future. I suspect.
That's very interesting. So I just want to say two things. One of them is I think that really vibes very well with an idea that Owen and I have been exploring, which is the idea of ontological design, meaning that you can design reality by basically curating the perception of people, by carefully curating the configuration of digital touch points and actually also physical touch points with which the human interacts. And you can, solve that equation for the purpose of ontological creativity, for designing the person's sense of reality. Cults have been doing this. Facebook's been doing this. Now, a question that I have for you is, do you think that in this future where, people will be striving to dominate the substrate, will the ad revenue model still be king? Or do you foresee any sort of change in that? Is it still going to be a world where people are going to really try to extract attention, extract dollars from the users? Or will there perhaps be another one?
That's a really, really, really good question. So as we exist in virtual spaces more immersively, what will be the king of kings for business models? I suspect... so advertising, I would imagine, would still be a massive part of that. E-commerce in its various forms, I imagine, would still be a massive part of that. Although a lot more of that e-commerce will be for virtual goods, I suspect. I don't know precisely what that will look like, but I do think that people will be paying for more non-physical things increasingly. I would imagine if you went back 20 years, we paid for many less non-physical things than we do now in the next 10 years and then the next 5 years. I would imagine that going forward that trend would continue. So e-commerce, Amazon, obviously not an unsubstantial company. I would suspect that in this virtual environment, if your needs can be fulfilled with a thought, with a word, with a tap, those needs will often involve physical goods or digital goods. So I suspect that will be also rather powerful. But what might throw a wrench into some of that, and you're really kind of making me think about this problem for the first time. What's the business model in this space? What might throw a wrench into that is I'm not exactly sure how many physical processes in the world today will enter the virtual world and then become massive virtual economies while they are physical now. So finance is obviously still going to be a very, very big deal. Right now, we don't think of finance as like hot, sexy tech stuff, but if it becomes seamlessly enmeshed with everything that we're doing with those e-commerce transactions, with that advertising, with how we're sustaining ourselves and building savings or whatever in these virtual worlds, I imagine that'll get pulled in. So I guess to answer your question again, I haven't contemplated it in robust depth. I suspect e-commerce and advertising will still be very powerful. I also suspect a good deal of industries that today are really done on a handshake, are done by a guy driving a truck from one place to another place, are going to get sucked into a virtual world, and that those will become big digital economies. Exactly which, I can't tell you right now. But that's my gut, to be honest. Haven't given it.
Because I think that somehow connects with, let's say, the design of realities, maybe that becoming a digital good, maybe reality design itself becoming one of the determining factors, because perhaps, while physical reality is linear, then virtual reality is gestalt, or rather it teaches us that all reality is virtual. It doesn't really jive with the same patterns that real reality does. In real reality, this hand is not this hand, but in both dream states, as per Carl Jung, or in virtual worlds, as I would argue, just on a limb here, maybe the difference between things becomes much more diluted. The connection between the baseline ontology, epistemology of how we make sense of things can become creative prime matter.
100%. So I can't agree with you more in terms of, so I refer to this as sort of the increasing malleability of reality. So one of the factors of momentum here, I'm going to try to pull up the lengthier article that I have on this piece, just to kind of make sure I'm wording it the right way than I thought about it most robustly. But I think that virtual worlds, so initially what's going to happen is we're going to go in to pursue the things that we think we want in the physical world. So I've used this analogy, please pardon me, but I hope you'll chuckle. Like we'll go into VR to like be in a hot tub with 1997 Mariah Carey. You know what I mean? Like we'll go in for what we perceive our ideals to be. Like we'll enter in the pursuit of what we as hominids living in this physical world want. What will occur, I suspect, is that there will be permutations of experience in the virtual world that start to not really correlate all that well to what we know in the physical space. Mm-hmm. Whether it's how physics works, whether it's what we find attractive, whether it's what we do creatively, whether it's how many limbs we have. Right? You can enter virtual worlds and be a lobster where, you move certain muscles around your ribs and you're starting to move middle legs, in a virtual world. And so you don't necessarily have to have this physical shape in a virtual world. And it will become the case where that's not necessarily weird. That just kind of is. Everybody gets it. It's malleable. So let me give you an example of this. Let's take toddlers today, or let's even take teenagers today, and then let's take 60-year-old folks. For 60-year-old folks, the digital world and the physical world are pretty separate things. For teenagers today, they are one mesh of what life is. They're one mesh of what life is. And so at some point, the same will be the case for the malleability of physical experience, of sense, of creativity, of what we go in for. We will enter not for, I really liked that back in the monkey world. We will enter for blooming expanses of new sensory and creative and volitional kind of like activities that there's really very few proxies for in the real world. And those will be better, more attuned, more fulfilling, more creative, more interesting than anything we could have done in the regular space. And it will become somewhat obvious that blooming of experience is really the only path to greater creativity, greater fulfillment, greater tailoredness to our own unique preferences. I don't think that's going to happen immediately. I think all of initial VR is going to be proxying for what we think we want in the physical world. But I think as malleability becomes the norm, we're quickly just going to suck out into the vacuum of what could be, which is vastly more than the physics of this permits.
It's this wild consumer future, right? Like the digital is going to give us our dreams. And what it always makes me think about is how this is going to impact politics, political struggle, if that's going to be possible at all in a future where the majority of people can plug into a machine and get a fucking hot dopamine load of everything that supposedly the system wants. You know, the traditional left is already struggling in that it's almost impossible to unite people around anything common enough to pursue mainstream change, right? And I just foresee this kind of fragmentation at the level of consumer choice continuing more and more until people just, it's impossible to band together and actually to demand to change things. And then building on that as well, there will be a sense that already politics plays out still at the levels of capital and distribution of capital and other more classical resources. Digital space is barely on the agenda in most political conversations. The best they can really talk about is regulating the big companies, right? What should we do with data? But when it comes to the actual big power struggles between your Googles and your Facebooks and whoever these VR competitors are in the future, who are actually going to be owning reality space itself, I struggle to foresee how people who were once voters, once democratic citizens, are going to have much of a chance to interface with it at all, other than through their own consumer preferences expressions, which is always going to be given by the machine in advance.
I mean, I'm full blown with you. And I think that the wrestling around how is politics going to deal with this, I'd love to dive a little bit more into that. I believe that it may take us another 10 years, but here's the supposition that I have at the top of that substrate monopoly article. It's as follows. In the remaining part of the 21st century, all competition between the world's most powerful nations and organizations, whether economic, political, or military, is about gaining control over the computational substrate that houses human experiences and human experience and AI. So if you own that, so this is not going to be something that Lithuania does. This is not going to be something that Peru does very well. This is not going to be something that your mom and pop restaurant down the street does very well. But Google, the CCP, the Department of Defense, Facebook, they're players in this game. Look, if I'm lying, I'm dying. I'm just telling you, I think they're players in this game. And kind of end of story on that, in my opinion. So I think CCP already gets this. China already gets this. If they own the substrate, then yeah, they can. It's not just they can mold the perspectives and opinions that they'd like. Like you said, even your consumer preferences might be defined ahead of time. I think it'd be great if your political perceptions could be defined ahead of time. I think China's potentially doing, a decent job of what tyranny should look like. If you want to own opinion and you want to own, you want to squash dissent and you want to do that from the inside out. I think they're really going to be on their way. And I think, the Chinese virtual ecosystem that you wear on your face will be much like the Chinese virtual ecosystem that's on your laptop if you go there, which is to say very bounded to their aims. And that's one approach, right? One approach is you just lop off freedoms. I do think that you're right to say, how are people going to bind together and sort of make, democracy, quote unquote, sort of function if everybody go into these, what we could call kind of these lotus eating environments, and sort of have what they want. I think there's a lot of reasons why that's a very, very valid question. One of them is that I foresee that continued immersion in these sort of really, it won't just be, there won't just be a bifurcation between the people going into these systems to pursue power in the state of nature and those pursuing escape from it. There will also be a bifurcation between individuals, because if you're living in an environment totally tailored to you, that all of a sudden really doesn't have all that many correlations and proxies to the physical world, your ability to relate to other people might just not be real, right? If most of the time when I'm in VR, I'm a giant spider, okay? And I do things like, I don't know, I surf between galaxies and like, I have like some creative endeavors that are very strange. Like they correlate to no art that you've ever heard of. And like my like sexual drives have been kind of bent into like some weird, strange, I'm not saying this, this is like weird to say, but bent into some obscure perversion that has nothing to do with what males and females are attracted to right now, or very little, right? It's really, really very little, but that happens to it happens to be funneled in. It happened to resonate well enough. My imagination spun on it, and the programmatically generated systems kind of fed it to me. And that's how I fulfill needs. Like when I go and talk to you at a coffee shop, if such a thing still exists, or in a Zoom call, a virtual Zoom call, am I going to be able to relate to you better or worse than if I just lived in hominid reality where we're all talking about the same politics, the same sports teams, we all have the same physical forms that are only between a certain range of height, right? I'm going to have more in common with you. I suspect that human relationships, I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect that human relationships will become vastly, for the Lotus eaters, maybe the world eaters will be different. For the Lotus eaters, vastly less important. I believe that people will be able to have teachers who are not human teachers, but who can teach them Spanish, who can teach them singing, who can teach them whatever, writing, better than any human teacher could, because these will be programmatically generated entities with a form, with a voice, with an instruction that's much better than any human could do. Same thing with, we might say, and I hate to say this, same thing with maybe friendship, right? What if you had a friend who didn't have any of their own agendas, who didn't have any of their own tremendous baggage maybe, but who had the wisdom of, the Marcus Aurelius and, the knowledge of leadership of, Pericles and, Washington or something, and the, understanding of science of, name your damn people, right? Wouldn't their advice just be better? And wouldn't you almost prefer to hang out with them? The same starts to tweak in on the romantic side. It starts to tweak in, as we start to get haptics become a little bit more viable, really immersive VR becomes a little bit more viable. The perfect mate, if you will, I think this might be 30 years out. I'm not saying this is next year, may also become more viable. Now we're all the more disconnected. So I see us yanking away from a lot of personal connection on the Lotus Eater side. And I do think that that'll make it rather challenging to say, how do we wield politics? What does this look like when everybody just wants to jack into their own completely different weird space? I think it's going to be very challenging if we get there.
I imagine that you're just going to chill with your crew of perverted spiders, whether there's 5 of you or 50 of them or 500 of you, and that'll be it. You'll zip around the virtual universe. I mean, that's kind of already what happens on a lot of these message boards that exist these days, right? It's like, you might as well call people virtual spiders for some of the ways they act and indeed express their libido. Now, you mentioned this kind of like 30 years out. I'm curious to get a bit deeper into what you think the time span will be on this stuff. Because something that I find myself troubling over more recently is I think we're in for a bumpy ride over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Coronavirus, the economic breakdowns, we don't know what's going to happen with the environment. And things look like they're getting destabilized. There's a lot of anger. There's violence, certainly on the streets in America. If I was the CCP or someone else playing world building, it would begin to make a lot of sense to say, how can we be subtly prodding people more and more towards the VR world just so we can chill them down a bit, so they can express more of this energy into this fragmented virtual space instead of it playing out on the streets?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of its own conversation about whether the communist leadership of China sort of, like, right now, there's a lot of advantages. I mean, the best position to be in the world right now, if you were Napoleon, would be Xi Jinping. Just if he was reborn, right? It'd be the best. If you were to take flesh again, it would be the best flesh to choose at present. There is no better flesh at present. So the CCP has a lot of great advantages. Now, they've got some disadvantages, but they've got a lot of great advantages. One of them is that our digital ecosystem is very permeable. So you can come into America and you can buy our movie theaters. You can come into America, you can buy our gaming companies or buy sufficient chunks of them. You can come into America and open up a social account on YouTube, on Twitter, on whatever, and just get in front of as many Americans as possible. We're really permeable, and you can create content online in any language, and we're going to be able to search and find it literally 2 milliseconds later. And so we've got a really, our openings go both ways. We don't really have doors. Like, our doors don't have hinges. They don't have physical. Everybody walks in, everybody walks out. It's pretty easy stuff. China's got a little bit of a different ball game. A lot of stuff ain't going in there. And also, when you're in that ecosystem, you're really only accessing what they prefer that you access. And you're really only saying what they damn well prefer that you say. because you can be muted and drowned out, or they'll just come to your house and break your legs, right? And it's like not an exaggeration, right? I don't like people interpret this stuff as exaggerations. Like people have to Google things. You have to Google things. So so that's China. So their ecosystem, no Google, no Twitter, no Facebook, right? I mean, a lot of stuff ain't going in. Certainly America's not buying the movie theaters in China. They're not buying the gaming companies in China. So we've got this amazingly permeable system where if you wanted to stir dissent or bare minimum just stir confusion, then you just, the doors are open. I mean, economic doors, technological doors. I mean, they're not even there. Again, like we have a house, but there's no doors, there's no hinges, there's no locks. You just walk in when you want. Over there, of course, they have a really nicely controlled environment where the propaganda schema can be just perfectly molded by them. And I don't think that's an easy task, but I think that if you wanted to own mind space as people enter virtual space, you'd want to do it like China does. I'm not saying I wish America was like that. I'm just saying if you were Napoleon and you wanted to take flesh again, you would want to be Xi Jinping. I think he's in a great position to wield his human mass, in his substantial human mass, in a fruitful way, at least in the perspective of his ruling party and his own ambition. So yeah, I think our permeability is a beautiful thing. It's also a disgusting weakness in the face of adversaries that don't have anything like those kind of permeability issues.
One of the things that I like that this conversation now delved into politics, and I want to connect this with the term that we've been using, virtual realities, is the following. I usually say that virtual reality taught us that all reality is virtual. So in a way, even our current real reality doesn't really, what's the real line where it's separate, where it stops being real and it starts to become virtual? Well, my favorite post-humanist, Robert Pepperell, has a nice definition when he says that in the post-human world, the difference between the human and its environment is diluted. It doesn't really exist. They are a continuous mesh, like the Instagram kids that you mentioned today. Yep. And that's very interesting because in the same way that this jacket is a continuation of my skin because it helps me stay warmer, so is my computer a continuation of my brain in so many functions. And power is a property of the large CCPs, Googles, and Facebooks of this world. But Foucault said it's also a property of the small relations that exist, right? So much of contemporary leftism really likes to take that and politicize that. However, from the perspective of irregular warfare, and I'm going to get more specific here, irregular warfare is really about taking, let's imagine Surkov and the Russians and the information campaigns that have been put on the democracy that is America. In irregular warfare, size doesn't really matter too much. What matters is the real relationships, the small relationships of power that can be sort of weaponized. So I can pay a guy $800 a month to keep making Facebook posts and creating Facebook events so that, a couple of groups in America get together and they are from opposite sides of a political spectrum and there's maybe a fight happening there. And polarization increases despite the fact that this guy is working on a budget. It's the same thing. It's like using a $200 bomb to take down a $2 million drone.
Yeah.
There's a sort of asymmetrical aspect to that. I want to poke your brain now on the following. In the virtual world, there's also asymmetrical dynamics happening. So I would argue or ask you, is it that the Googles and the Facebooks of this world, being the giant behemoths that they are in their relationship with the physical world, will that domination automatically translate to the virtual world? Or is it that there will be players or a know-how or a craft or a democratized sort of craft that will allow people to understand that, hey, reality is actually this very malleable thing. And this is currently the field of battle. So we can create our own insurrection here. We can maybe try to protect our little bubble of reality from whatever other powers are there. I don't know if this is clear.
Yeah, let me see if I can clarify, and then I'm happy to dive in.
Yeah.
You're saying, are the only folks that are viably able to compete, the CCP, the U.S. government or something, Facebook, Google, Baidu, are they the only people that are going to be able to create these spaces and curate these spaces, or are individual clusters of people going to be able to, step up and really throw a wrench in the gears and either create their own or really screw up the big existing systems of the Facebooks and the Googles? Is this kind of what you're talking about? Will the little guy have enough advantage to just really be chewing apart the big guys? Is this kind of what you're getting at?
Kind of. So let me try to summarize it in the following. Is the current balance of physical power in the physical world going to translate into the virtual world, or is there a rebalancing going to come about?
Well, I already think there's a rebalancing. I don't know if I mentioned this on our last interview, but I had a friend who's relatively high up in the United Nations and was at a World Economic Forum event with one of the, let's go 8 years back, one of the, leading execs at Google, you could say the leading exec at Google, and sort of, jestingly kind of talking about, Google potentially being more powerful than countries, and sort of receiving quite an affirmative, understood answer that yes, that is of course the case, and that they themselves understand this rather well. Google doesn't have that many tanks in so much as I know. Google's workforce, as far as I can tell, probably isn't very good at fist fighting. At least the ones that when I lived in Mountain View, I just, I presume I could probably take out a couple of them. Not that I'd want to, right? I'm not saying that, but that's not what they're built for, right? I mean, it's not a rugby team. These are developers, right? I mean, so, and they shouldn't be. I'm not saying they should all be burly fellas with swords, right? Of course they're not. That's the example. So already I think we see companies that are more powerful than many countries, more influential than many countries, who own none of the physical power stuff that you and I are talking about. Google doesn't own as much space as Lithuania. Google doesn't have as many tanks as Lithuania. Google doesn't have a fighting force. Google just influences a digital ecosystem, and we could argue that pound for pound they're more influential and in a great many ways more powerful than entire countries. So I think that'll continue. I think that the big physical powers, particularly from a politics perspective, so right now mostly the US and China, in my opinion, have a bit of an up because they get to mold how the law works and how things operate within their countries. Their countries are very rich, and so they're going to see a lot of that innovation, right? It would be very unusual if the next Google came out of, I don't know, Ecuador, right? I guess it's possible, but I wouldn't bet $20 on it. So it's very likely that the highest innovations are going to happen in these wealthy nations, and that they'll have some ability to decide how they want that power to extend out of their country and into the world. China, of course, will be able to make all of those entities into tendrils and wielded arms for behooving the ends of the Chinese Communist Party. The United States doesn't do really does nothing of the same kind of overtness of that. But will potentially have some ability, right? If Google got to some point where they had developed artificial general intelligence that was pretty convincing, it seems likely that the DoD could, whenever they want, just kind of walk over there and take it. It seems like that's probably what would happen, right? If it became a dire and existential thing, like, oh, Google within 2 years is going to be more powerful than the United States. It's like, well, probably the DoD would just take it. And probably most Americans would prefer that. They would prefer like the country have it as opposed to whatever. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm just suspecting that's the case. So there's some advantage, I suspect, to the physical power correlates now. They got the big economies. They're likely to see the big innovations, and they kind of get to decide what happens to those firms as they're coming up. China gets to wield them just like another arm. Just tack on another arm, call it TikTok, call it Alibaba, whatever you want to do, and start swinging with that thing. The U.S., a little bit less hands-on, but when push comes to shove, they'll probably ultimately have control over the most powerful tech if they really want to. Google just doesn't have fighter planes, right? I mean, the DoD could take out 2/3 of Google employees in any given 15-minute span. That's why I think the physical world will still have a lot of sway. I might be able to be convinced otherwise, but I think there's some real magnetism to these places of real physical power.
Now, that's maybe precisely where I'd like to press you. The nature of the power of Google and of the Department of Defense are very different. Now, power is not always overt and manifested through armies or physical force. It could be argued that the ability of information purveyance and dissemination companies like Google is a power that is softer, more occult, more hidden, and that nonetheless might have a large impact on the rest of the substrate on which it exists. For example, the factors that led Rome to fall include external force factors, but there were also internal, let's call it, what's the word? Mimetic, ideological, or religious. I don't know how to call them, right? Yeah. Alexander Dugin calls this noomachia. It's the war of the nous, of the mind. It's a war of mind entities, of egregores, of autonomous bodies of ideas. Now, this is why I'm bringing this up, because it feels like the Googles and Facebooks of this world, why they don't have armies, and thank God, they might be producing a sort of more subtle influence on the world. And you mentioned that America, in this case, is very permeable. The open and freedom of speech and the open environment makes it more permeable to incursions precisely on this sphere, right? That's why it's plausible and so accurate that information campaigns might have been done from other countries towards America and, hide them between 20 shell companies. But we all know that it's totally possible and totally easy. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to dive a little bit deeper into. It's the dynamics of warfare or competition that exist in this noosphere, in this psychosphere, in the sphere of ideas, and the struggle that exists there seems to be kind of the definitional struggle. It's going to be the Waterloo, if you want to keep Napoleoning. It's going to be the Waterloo that's going to define who's going to be the hegemon in the next few years. So it's not only going to be the physical hegemony, but maybe there's a big role to play in the noomachia sphere. Well,
I mean, I'm with you, and I my stomach turns for where America's at for a great number of reasons. In terms of the new sphere, I mean, if I'm to use the term, and I don't know if I'm doing so correctly, but there's pretty clearly increasing division in the U.S. Across a number of different strata. And I think it might be easy to stoke those fires. There's a chance that certain things aren't reparable with that division, and that maybe that would lead to something pretty rough. I think that there's a book about the rise and fall of dynasties from I believe the 1300s, written by Ibn Khaldun, a book called the Muqaddimah, which is essentially tries to analyze why dynasties rise and fall. And one of the big concepts here, kind of the big driving point, something he calls group feeling, which we might describe as solidarity. And I think that if you can wield your digital ecosystem in a way that encourages solidarity and industry, so that is to say, hard work and at least some sense of we're the same. So hard work and some sense of we're the same. If you can do that, you're going to have a decent shot at maintaining dynasty. If you can't do that, you're going to have a really, really hard time. And that often after a certain number of generations, people lose any reference for hard work. I would say any third or fourth generation Americans, not all of them, a great many of them, though, their perception of hardship is embarrassing. I'm embarrassed from afar about it, and it's just tough, man. It's really, really tough. What seems like hardship, what seems like challenge, what seems like difficulty for someone born, third, fourth generation into such a wealthy country. Even if you're in the lower band of the middle class, it's still like, it's not Colombia, it's not India, it's not 1820s American New England or something like that, where you were, farming it and doing everything else. We just lost a lot of the references, and I think there's some of that in China as well. But but yeah, both of those things, industry and solidarity, I think are what you want to maintain. I suspect in the digital space, so long as we're still hominids with the same equipment, two things will be preeminent. And I think that there's an argument to be made that China can do that, that they can do that stuff pretty good with an ownership of the virtual ecosystem, while we might be able to just have our system shattered to bits over and over by for-profit companies who are potentially incentivized to have these echo chambers rattle against each other for all of eternity. And I'm not saying that Facebook is bad, right? I'm not deifying or demonizing Zuckerberg. I'm just saying it just so happens that probably makes a lot more money than when people are cool with each other, right? So that plus the permeability, by golly, I mean, at least on the solidarity front, I'd love to be Xi Jinping. I'm not saying I advocate for authoritarianism. You understand? I'm just saying I would love to be Xi Jinping if I wanted solidarity.
It feels worth mentioning here, Daniel, you already threw out the name Surkov, but Surkov's story without Sky is just a symbolic illustration of exactly just what we've just been talking about. Like the basic idea being it's about a small village that has a war fought in the sky above it. And the war is a war between invisible combatants who just send invisible airships to just blow each other up. And they're coming from all directions and there's combatants on all sides. The people can't see the battle. The only thing that happens is every now and again, a piece of debris flies down or falls on someone and kills them or turns them flat. That's the metaphor he uses. It turns them flat. And then there's a city away from this village that has just walls around it. And at the end, all these refugees from the war try to come, all these flat two-dimensional refugees from the war try to come into the city, and the city just won't let them in. Now, the way I read it is that the city is the strategy that your Russia and indeed probably your China are going for. Surkov was at one point advising Putin. And I think the illustration of the village with the invisible warfare, that is the newest fear at the moment in these permeable digital ecosystems. Now, the kind of troubling question is it that binary, right? Are we stuck? Is it either cities with closed walls with tightly controlled digital ecosystems that might allow for, as you've said, hard work and a sense of belonging to something? And is the other alternative just kind of digital schizophrenia? I don't fucking know, but it's scary. And on that point, I think there's a kind of question that I'd like to ask you, Anne, which is spoken about the world building, the perspective of the big powers, the companies, even the politicians. But I think a lot of our listeners are youngsters like ourselves who are smart and paying attention to what's going on at the moment. Do you have any sense of what people should be doing? Any recommendations?
Oh man, I mean, I'm loath to think that I'm even right about what I'm talking about here. I mean, I'm taking some stabs with you. I have some ideas about what the weaknesses of free nations sort of are right now. I have some stabs at what the trajectory of these technologies will do to the human experience, but I won't pretend to crystal ball. Is there anything that I have? I mean, I would say the only thing that I feel pretty firm about is that we should really be discussing and hashing out what potentially new, whether that be evolutionary or revolutionary change, what potentially new balance we create with the virtual human experience. How is this to be, if we are to live, if we were to have solidarity in industry, which I think are pretty good things to have, then how are we to manage that? And I think that there's some interesting ideas floating around. I don't have any authors in mind, but I've heard it mentioned that by default, the strategy would be to just do what China's doing. They are the precedent of how to manage that. But I think that an important exercise that I don't have a prescription for, but that I would advocate we should talk about, would be what is another way? In other words, the way that I've framed it is, can we maintain our values and freedoms, and in so doing also strengthen ourselves relatively in the international space? Because if we virtue our way to having open doors and virtue our way to all these things that ultimately just decimate any kind of democratic country get steamrolled economically and ideologically and technologically by other powers, then in my opinion, they're not really virtues. So can we uphold those virtues in a way that strengthens and bolsters our actual ability to survive? So what would be that new way in terms of virtual ecosystems, their governance, their whatever it be, taxation and business model stuff, how we interact with external powers and users in general, how data is used for different kinds of folks. Are there dynamics we can experiment with, and maybe a vision we can start to inch closer to that will allow us to maintain values and survivability and strength? If not, I think the default is crumbling or modeling China, which may not be ideal in terms of what we want to build in the world. So that's the only thing I feel really strongly about is that I think that conversation needs to happen.
It's very interesting because there's not really any model historically for large democracies and their survival. The American experiment is unique in that sense, being like a superpower and a democracy. Has a hard time dealing with this. Let me just read a little bit of Surkov so that you really have a feeling.
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
So he's referring to the first non-linear war, where it's a war of all against all. He's speaking about the coalitions and what coalitions they were, not like the earlier ones. It was a rare state that entered the coalition intact. What happened was some provinces took one side, some took the other, and some individual city or generation or sex or professional society of the same state took a third side. And then they could switch places, cross into any camp you like, sometimes even during battle. So I think what this quote really speaks about is the gestalt nature of irregular warfare. Whereas, there's obviously traditional warfare has linear factions, and you know very clearly who's doing battle. I feel that as we move towards this virtual world that is so inexorably marching towards us from the future, that also the nature of how we perceive war is going to get really mashed because, maybe I'm a spider and I have two arms against other two arms, even myself containing multitudes and them all being recruited and recruited for some faction doing war.
I mean, I'm not as familiar with these philosophers that you bring up, but I'm very interested in this work. I'm interested in this airplane and debris analogy, like all these analogies. Like, I wonder, like I have the cauldrons from which I dip my ladle, which are normally history, biography, sort of Greece and Rome. But I dig what you're pulling into this conversation here, and I think that that swapping of factions and confused constant conflict, feels like today's social media. It feels like such a cliche thing to say, but it does feel like today's social media. And I wonder if there's a way around that. I do think that your idea of irregular, this notion that you brought up of irregular warfare, I think it's the game as far as I can tell. Like China is doing the right things by using debt, for example, to win its ports. By buying media companies and gaming companies in the States and then making sure they can't talk about Uyghurs. Right? That's very different than dropping a bomb on Pearl Harbor. Very, very different. You're going to get a very different response from the international, community. It's more plausibly deniable. It's potentially actually more influential and powerful, but it's not really warfare like we think about it, right? And I think that that's where the game is going to play out, and I think the folks that are really sharp and savvy in that irregular space are going to be the winners. And I fear that our current dynamic of permeability and our current incentives for our current digital ecosystem companies are not really going to permit for a strong West. I'm not demonizing Silicon Valley. I'm just saying I think we really need to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. I wholly agree. This is like the China situation, due to their unique Confucian backgrounds and the way that they cohere around making society happen, seems to have positional advantage when it comes to comparing itself with democracies who tend to be open and foster innovation. And innovating is hard, copying is easy, and there's the momentum, the momentum of the petrodollar and of post 45 hegemony and prosperity might be coming to an end precisely because it's so open, precisely because it's so vulnerable, because it's like a breath. It took its breath and now it feels like, will it be waning? Well, I'm not in America, but when I look at the news, it does certainly feel like it's crumbling under its own weight. Like you say, the question is really, can democracy graduate to the digital age and stop thinking like it's 1820?
I think that's maybe a good way to put it. Can democracy graduate to the digital age? I think that might be a really good way of nutshelling it, to be honest. And creating that new vision is going to be another roll of the dice, right? That could go wrong in more ways than it could go right. But I do think that if we're conscious about it, it may be possible to move in a better direction where values and survivability are strengthened. Where I think that's worth worth striving for, Jen. So I'm glad we got to end on that note here today as we come towards 10.
Yeah. That sounds precisely it. I just want to add another one. I don't want to keep you for too long. It feels like the values that need to perhaps graduate are not only the values of democracy, but the ones that underpin it, the Enlightenment values, the Illuminism, all those thinkers. They came up with something, and it feels like the internet age requires something different. So that might be it.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't surprise me if there's some additional wave of kind of underpinning values that also needs to evolve. And, that wave had some struggles, my good man, to come about. And I think the next one will too. I've got my fingers crossed. We'll all be all right in the transition. But yeah, I'll have to read more of those authors you guys quoted today. I appreciate getting schooled a little bit on your areas of expertise today.
I'll make sure to send.
Oh man, we love your schooling too, man. It's always good talking to you.
Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us. Thank you for your time, and bye-bye.
Always a pleasure. All right, catch you later, guys.
Bye-bye.
Take care, mate.
We hope you enjoyed the show. Consider becoming our patron and helping us put out more content like this.
Patreon.com/Technosocial.